So today it's a pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Professor Cees Dekker from Delft University. Let me give you a little bit of information about him. He did his PhD in physics in the University of Utrecht, a thesis entitled Two-Dimensional Spin Glasses. I might ask you what that means. And he moved to a position in Delft in 1993. As a physicist, he's moved towards biology. He is, I'm told, the Netherlands' most highly cited physicist. So the envy of many of us who are publishing scientists, I discovered that he has published over 270 research papers, and at least 11 of those have been cited more than 1,000 times each. That's the measure of the sort of scientist that we have with us this afternoon. In 2007, he coordinated a new initiative in Delft, setting up a bio-nanoscience division, hence the move from the sort of more physical to the more biological backgrounds, and his interests now are in nanobiology, the interface between nanotechnology and biology, and it covers things like synthetic biology, molecular motors, DNA repair, all sorts of the breadth of science. As well as his intense scientific research, he's also published a book which at the moment is only in Dutch for children, on science and evolution in particular, which is getting very good reviews in Holland, and we look forward to that sometime being translated, I hope. So that's the measure of the person that we're privileged to have speak to us this afternoon. Rather modestly, he's titled his talk, My Meanderings in Science and Faith. But Cees, we look forward to hearing your talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here. Actually, yesterday I spoke a full-hour talk on my science in the new Maxwell Center at Physics. Today, and I do this type of science talks like most active scientists every 2 weeks or so in some conference or other venue. Today's talk for me is a little different because I'm not used so much to talk about science and faith. I do this for students a lot, but I must say I'm here at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. I find it a little intimidating in the sense that I really value the British tradition on scholarship and thinking about how science and faith relate extremely well. So I'm impressed by the activities here at Cambridge in fostering a very positive relation between science and faith. And I've been indebted also to Dennis Alexander and many other people here in thinking about this. So I'm speaking here today, and somebody in a very creative way has made a roadmap for me, which was on this poster announcing this talk, where you see all kind of lines running from God to trust, from graphene to biomimetic nanopores, and they cross at all kind of crossroads. So this talk will be about that, a little bit like that map in the sense that it's a little different routes which sometimes cross and overlap. So I will share some of my different thoughts about my paths in physics and metaphysics in a sense. Just as a brief introduction, I'm 56-year-old. I have a family, a wonderful family with 3 kids, 1 married. I got a PhD in experimental physics, so I'm really a physicist. Currently I'm a professor at TU Delft, that's in the Netherlands. And I'm a Royal Academy professor now from the Royal Academy of Sciences in Holland. And my research is at the interface of nanotech to synthetic biology. I'm also a Christian. I'm active in worship, leading worship in my charismatic church. I'm also actually a vivid bluegrass bass player and dobro and all kind of acoustic music. And I'm quite involved in the debates about science and religion in the Netherlands, both at a general audience level in discussions, debates between atheists and Christians about God, as well as in the Christian community about creation and evolution in particular. So that's briefly my background for a sort of glimpse with many of the aspects that will come back in this talk. So my walking guide for today's meandering path is the following. I will say something about my path in science first, and then something briefly about my path in faith, in the Christian faith. And then I briefly say a few words on how these two concepts in my life, at least, relate. And to me, the concept of a worldview has been a very helpful tool, actually, to think about that. So I'll say a few words about that. And then I'll zoom in into what for myself and for many in society is actually one of the major crossing points of science and religion, is actually the discussion about evolution and creation. And I will say a few words which I thought might be interesting for you, to say something about how this discussion has unfolded in the Netherlands. And then Kees was also sort of stimulating me to not only focus on that, but maybe say something, given the fact that I work in nanotechnology, synthetic biology, say a few words on, for example, my research effort, which are, as I'm going to tell you, also aimed at sort of building the functionality of living systems out of components, and how that relates to sort of this broader view on how that relates to even religion. All right, so I'm going to end up with a few words, very briefly, some few words on that. So that's the walking guide for today. So let's start. So if I think about all these meandering paths, I mean, it even prompted the question when I prepared this talk, actually, why do I do it that way? So what drives me in all of that? And I'm a sort of person that stands in this world completely bewildered, in a sense. And I have a sense of wonder. What is it all about? Why is it this way? And science for me is one of the methodologies, actually, to make sense of some of the patterns of this complex world, and to do that. So I have a sense of wonder and also a questioning mind, also always asking why and how. And I'm sort of on a search for truth with my science, but broader than that, with my whole attitude. I want to find how things are, find truth. And I really love this quote from Isaac Newton, where he said once, "I do not know what I may appear to the world, but to myself I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore, and diverting myself in now and then finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." I love that image, that you have this complete sea of things to be discovered there. There's yourself already like that kid there, so happy with the tiny pebble or shell that you discovered. And I feel that in my science, what I do is indeed finding the tiny pebble, and I'm very happy with that, and enjoying that science so much. But there's this bigger reality out there to be discovered further. So that drives me. So if I look at my path in science, Keith was already introducing me with my PhD in spin glasses. Indeed, that is where I started, mid-80s. I started in condensed metaphysics, which I liked so much, because there I could connect very concrete theories to actual measured things. Things like atoms, which have spins, and connect that. Experiment theory connection was to me very important, because very concrete. Actually, before that, I pondered a little bit about medical physics, but I was a little put off, because at that time, to me, it came across as so phenomenological. The system was so difficult. And actually, interesting, as a sort of a twist of fate, I ended up now in sort of nanobiology again, where again now I look at sort of biology and physics, quantitation, but now connected quite well. So actually, over the years, my fields have been changing quite a bit, quite radically even. Sort of in the 90s, I moved, say, from condensed metaphysics into a field which is called mesoscopic physics, the physics of tiny electron systems, small puddles where you can put single electrons even and get quantitation of currents, and it's a very fascinating field. Then I went sort of in the mid-90s, I picked up a couple of new areas where we would go into molecular electronics and the carbon nanotubes, these molecules that can really conduct currents. And then end of the 90s, I made a rather radical change, because I was about 40, I was just appointed full professor, and I saw these fields lying before me, and the whole molecular electronics and the nanotube field would develop more towards an applied area, with nothing wrong with applied science, but my interest was more in the fundamental science, and I really decided I want to move to biology, as I had the idea that there's much more really new and fundamental things to be learned in the biology field. So as a bit of a freshman in biology, I started as this
physicists that want to explore and use these techniques that I've learned, that I did learn about from nanotechnology to explore biology. So indeed, I moved to single molecule biophysics, and then to nanobiology, to synthetic biology, and we'll see where we end up. So that's quite a meandering path, and a bit more in detail, sort of the mid-90s, there really sort of, if you want to say, my claim to fame from the 90s is in this field of molecular electronics, where we were the first to really look at these carbon nanotube molecules, which is these cylindrical molecules only consisting of carbon, and they're wonderful objects because they can conduct a current. So we would get that molecule across electrodes and measure currents and build transistors for the very first time that worked actually at room temperature. And this whole field has led to graphene and other fields later on, and it was very exciting times. And I was saying, end of the 90s, we changed our field, my field, from say this quantum nanophysics to nanobiology, and that was driven by this quest, what I started out saying, like this wonder, because I'm really fascinated by the complexity of biology. As a physicist, as an outsider even, if you go into that field, and I don't know whether you realize, some of you will, some of you won't, but if you look into the cell, there's all these machines. This cell is an utterly fascinating microcosmos of molecular machines, where you have polymerases reading off DNA, transferring information to messenger RNA, which are transported through nuclear pores to be processed by other machines called the ribosome, which are producing other protein machines, which do all the functionality, some of which you see in these animations here, which is this utterly fascinating world that is alive, that is at the basis of our living cells. So I was driven by fascination by machines like this FOF1 ATPase, where you have a rotary motor which actually drives the synthesis of ATP molecules, which is the fuel for all the biological processes by which you are moving and thinking and what have you. So this was what drove me into biology, and indeed in my own, given my background in techniques, in nanotechniques, we use techniques with beads and microstructures and small holes to drive molecules, to manipulate molecules, to pull on molecules, and so forth. So if you go to my website nowadays, you can see that in my current research in my group basically is in this area. So it's in single molecule biophysics, in solid state nanopores, and in bacteria towards synthetic division, synthetic cells. So in this single molecule biophysics, what we do is we take, for example, a bead and we attach the DNA molecule, and then we apply a magnetic, with an external magnet, we apply forces on that bead, and we can stretch DNA molecules like a string that you just hold in your hands. You can stretch molecules, you can rotate molecules, which is extremely important because in your cells all the DNA is negatively supercoiled, wrapped up in platinemic supercoils like that. And we have the tools with these beads and also the scanning probe techniques to look at those structures at the single molecule level, which to me is fascinating. We're humans at the scale of 1 meter. We can manipulate this stuff at the 1 nanometer, 1 millionth of a millimeter scale. Another area that we are very active in is solid state nanopores. This is a technology where we take DNA and we put it through tiny holes, and then we traverse molecules through the tiny hole, and in doing so we read off the current that is passing by the DNA molecule. And if we do that, actually, we can extract information about the DNA. We can extract the genomic code, we can extract proteins that are bound along the DNA as this molecule moves through, and we're exploring graphene and plasmonics structures to get more and more information out of these molecules. And the newest area in my group is basically this area where we put bacteria in nanostructures. I gave a full talk about it yesterday. And where basically we enclose bacteria, confine them. We actually make triangular shaped bacteria, we deform them, and we study proteins and DNA organization within living cells. And my latest efforts, I'm going to tell you, is more going towards synthetic cells. So what the approach in the last 15 years has been that we have this wonderful object, this cell, and we zoom in on one of the components, and then we take all this, techniques to study the biology at a single molecule level. Now, if I look forward, I really want to go the other way around. So not zoom in and investigate something, but go to the components and zoom out again and see if actually we can understand the difference between the structure on the left and the right here. What you see on the left here is an image of a bacterium. It's a living object, a bacterium. And this has a number of components. in yellow, purple and green and so forth here. There's thousands of components, protein, lipids, other components, which make up this object, which is a living object, a living cell. If I take exactly the same components and put them in a test tube, like on the right, it's just a mixture of molecules. What is the essential difference between the left and right? It must be in the organization in space and time of these molecules. And this is what I want to basically probe in the coming decades. Can we understand the organization of these components into objects that you could be thinking about as living? So we do top-down studies where we study DNA, proteins, and bacteria with novel shapes. So we shape up bacteria in squares or triangles, or actually even the letters TU Delft. We can shape. This is an E. This letter E is one bacterium, and what you see in color, the color yellow there, is a protein, the Min proteins that are actually toggling back and forth, making pattern. So we study pattern formation about how cells are spatially organized at that level. And also, as I said, we are starting efforts to start bottom-up building biological functionality. And there's a long, century-old, tradition of thinking that way. For example, physicists like Erwin Schrödinger famously wrote a book like What is Life? The physical aspect of the living cell. Coming from physics, thinking about quantitative descriptions of these biological molecules, thinking about principles that you might uncover in the living world, and the sort of efforts that me and many colleagues in this field of synthetic biology are starting is to also try to extract fundamental principles underlying living systems based on this bottom-up approach. When Richard Feynman died, there was a quote on his blackboard that said, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." And I love that quote because I really believe in that approach, that engineering approach, that if you make something, if you engineer something yourself, you really gain deeper knowledge than if you just hands-off think about the system top-down. So I really think with this sort of spirit, what we're trying to do is to think about, can we make a synthetic cell that divides? Of course, a cell is such a complex object with many aspects, so I cannot do this on my own. So what we need is a whole consortium of scientists, ranging from biochemists that work on metabolism to physicists like myself that work on the more mechanistic aspects of this. And so my efforts will be to sort of think about a liposome, which we fill with purified proteins, for example, to make ring-like polymer structures that contract. And then hopefully we get some spatial control over that ring, have that ring induce a constriction, and then divide a cell-like object into daughter cell-like objects. And that's what I'm basically setting up. And once you have something like that, you can grow cells, then divide them and cycle them back and set up a sort of evolutionary life cycle of such a system. We have very early stages of this approach. So what we just published last month is a paper where we have an on-chip technique to make such liposomes. So we make these liposomes and we have our efforts where we now have the first rings in these kind of liposomes, and that's where we are. So it's really the first baby steps in this direction only. So that's the very first part. That's a very quick bird's eye view of my meandering path in physics. I'm here to talk about the physics and the metaphysics. So what is about my path in metaphysics? I'm a Christian. I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. As I told you, I'm a very questioning person. I don't only think about science, I also think about the bigger existential, metaphysical questions about the meaning of life, God, suffering, value, beauty, the nature of my humanity, my identity. And in thinking about this, I've really found answers on such deeper questions in God. And in particular, Christianity resonates very strongly and provides me with a fitting worldview, a view on how I can look at this, a framework to look at this reality around me, and it resonates very strongly with it. I really love this quote by C.S. Lewis, I believe in Christianity as a belief that the sun has risen. Not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And that is the way I can also feel. I mean, the sun is out today, so actually if you go out, you can look at the sun. Actually, you cannot look into the sun because it's too bright. But by the light of the sun, by the reflection of all the things, I can see that tree there, I can see that wall there, I can see other things in its right perspective. And it's a great metaphor of God and the Christian worldview, because by believing in God, we can see all these other elements in the right perspective. When I talk about science and faith, I typically end up, as I'm going to do in a minute as well, in a rather intellectual consideration. And I want to also mention that disclaimer that is in the bottom here, that faith in itself is of course much more than merely an intellectual answer to my intellectual questions. Faith itself involves a relationship with God Almighty. It involves trust, it involves grace, it involves discipleship and serving your neighbor and all that. So there's many more aspects, but I find it also useful to also consider the more intellectual aspect, because many times there's this image that there is basically a very bad resonance between intellectual considerations and faith in God, and I don't recognize that at all. So how about science and religion? I told you I'm a scientist, I told you that I'm a Christian believer. How do you really relate to me? I mean, people ask me, and I feel, again, a little intimidated in these surroundings here, where people have, with much scholarship, put forward many broad thoughts about this. But to me, this question is almost too large to handle in a serious academic way. So I will talk about from my personal experience. So then, the first thing I would like to say is religion in itself is, to me, a too broad term. I would like to discuss the Christian faith, because of many reasons. One is that I can feel that from within how that actually is. And so I believe in a personal God that can be known through Jesus Christ. And I will talk about from that framework on how I think about science and religion. And you can also ask yourself, what is science? And I'll talk about natural science. I'm a physicist. Once in my sort of inauguration speech as a professor, I defined science myself for what it's worth. Again, full academics from the philosophy can probably correct me here, but to me, I define science as a human activity that seeks logical explanations for phenomena in the world through reasoning and experimental verification. And we can discuss that if you like. So if I think about these two aspects to myself, actually, it fits wonderfully within my Christian worldview. If you asked Jesus Christ, what is the biggest thing to pursue, he would say that is to love God and your neighbor with all of your heart, all of your soul, and all of your mind. So to love God with the full depth of my mind is part of the assignment that God even gives man. And so in that sense, science for me fits wonderfully in that context. And on a broader scale, in the first chapter of the Bible, in Genesis, God gave mankind a commandment to rule the world as responsible stewards. Okay? Science is a methodology that is wonderfully useful in that context, because we can explore this world to find all kind of wonderful knowledge that we can use to further knowledge in itself, and also to help develop applications that help mankind in general, and to serve its role in a steward role for humanity. So I feel that science is wonderful, fit in the Christian worldview. Also, when I think about science, I want to make the remark that there should be a sort of plea for some modesty, because I'm a scientist, I love science, and I think it's very valuable. But I like this quote by Hendrik Casimir, who is the founder of Philips Research and one of the also people early involved in quantum theory. He said about physics, something which I like, which he said, theories in physics are an approximate description of a limited part of the physical phenomena that itself are only a limited part of human experience. I think that's true, and science is super strong in making strong statements when you do it in the right context. But what we sometimes do is to extrapolate that too much to the metaphysical level, to extrapolate there. So science would have its place. So when I tell you this story, it all sounds like wonderful and harmonious, but I live in a world, in broader society, as well as among my colleagues, where many people see this very differently. So many people see science as a foundation of atheism. There's this Nobel laureate from Delft, I think the only one we have actually from Delft, who very strongly thought about this. He said the physicists who have a split personality to be able to still believe in God. He really proposed that it is almost impossible to be and a physicist and a believer, which I strongly disagree with. And there's a wonderful quote by Herman Philips, a famous atheist philosopher in Holland. He says, an atheist is not arrogant, he just thinks deeper, which is an interesting statement. And the question, of course, is he right? I personally strongly disagree with him. But these kind of remarks are exemplary for a broader idea, I would say the myth of the 20th century, that there is this huge conflict between science and religion. A myth actually implanted, I think, by influential books at the end of the 19th century, and had been very influential during the 20th century. And actually, this myth is not grounded as sort of the serious philosophers of science and historians have shown, have basically studied this idea and found it actually wanting. But still, this kind of conflict idea I've been struggling with in the last, or discussing this the last 20 years quite a bit. So you can ask the question, is coherence really possible? Can you really be at a deep level a scientist and at a deep level at the same time a Christian? And so here it's very helpful to have some historic notions. For example, the bare fact that many of the great pioneers of science, including Michael Faraday, after which this institute is named, were deep believers in God. So it would be already somewhat odd if science as methodology emerged from all these minds of people who were themselves strong believers. And actually so are many modern Christians like Francis Collins or Bill Phillips or others. And many people do not know, but I'm sure many of you do know, but many people in the broad audience do not know that Christianity itself has been an important driving force in the development of modern science. I was having high table dinner yesterday at a college. Many of these colleges came out of the Middle Ages and were founded out of theological traditions. Almost walking around in Cambridge is almost impossible to escape this, I would say. But many times it's not so known that many theological notions that to us as Western people are very intuitive nowadays. But the fact that there is an order that relates to the fact that the Christian theology teaches that there is a rational God of order, that there's natural laws, that God created a world of orderly phenomena, that nature itself is a created entity, not godly in itself. So not a pantheistic view, but a theistic view. A contingent world to be explored, experimented. All these basic notions underlie the development of modern science, partly. So is the Christian worldview unscientific? No, I would argue not. Actually, historically, you can see that Christianity has stimulated science. Many Christians, like myself and many others, are Christians. So I do think that there's a really a misunderstanding. In the scientific approach, indeed, we have something like methodological reductionism, breaking up a big problem into smaller units, very useful scientific tool. And many people sort of identify that with a more ontological reductionism, that life is nothing but physics, chemistry. You are nothing but your atoms. You're nothing but your brain, as Dick Swaap famously says in the Netherlands. So that's a metaphysical position which we can argue about, and that's not necessarily the same as this methodological reductionism. So to me, as I said, I've been thinking about how to relate my science and my faith in the last 2 decades in particular. And to me, the concept of worldview has been very useful in this. So the idea that each of us basically have a pair of glasses, have a certain way to view the world, which is formed by the way we were brought up, by books we read, by ideas we find inspiring, by the bigger concept thinking through this. And this basically colors our glasses in a certain way to look at the world around us. So an atheist has a certain worldview, a Christian has a certain worldview, a feminist, a Hindu. There are all kind of different views that can basically give a basic framework to view the world. And the question to me is actually, what pair of glasses gives me the clearest view of reality, in a sense? I want to try up different pairs of glasses and try to see which pair of glasses give me the best view. And so many times when people argue there's a conflict between science and religion, I've sort of concluded that there's no conflict between science and religion, but there is another conflict actually happening. And that's basically a conflict between a theistic, religious worldview and a different worldview, which is an atheistic, purely secular worldview. There's 2 different ways to view the same phenomena. And these basically are very different worldviews, and these sometimes conflict and give up all this discussion. So I'm an amateur, I'm a physicist, right? But I've edited a number of books, and one of the books I sort of, for myself, made a table at some point where I could look at, I don't know, ethics, or God, or science, or anything from, say, a purely atheistic point of view, or from a more theistic Christian world view. And you can argue about this, and I'm by nature a little bit provocative person, so some of these are phrased a bit provocatively, but that's the way it is. If I look at these different worldviews, I've been attracted to an atheistic worldview, thought deeply about that, but it does not fulfill me. It doesn't resonate with the deep sense of meaning that I experience in my life. Also, the dignity of man, free will, all kind of basic notions that I experience as real, I have to declare illusionary in an atheistic worldview. And for that reason, it doesn't convince me. Actually, there are philosophers like Richard Swinburne or so who do this in a much more professional way than I can do. And so, but I found the whole concept of worldview in that sense helpful to think about the relation between science and religion. Now, let me maybe turn to this issue of creation and evolution, because to many people, including myself, to myself as well, this has been sort of like the most clear example of a conflict between science and religion. So what we're talking about a long-standing contentious debate, the idea that in the beginning God created the world versus the idea that all arose through evolution. That's phrased in that way, and historically there's an enormous polarization among evolutionists and creationists. So if time has an issue about that, it's called evolution wars, and that's the metaphor, again, this conflict metaphor that often is seen. And you can ask yourself, why is that debate actually so emotional? So here you see myself discussing Herman Philipsen in some television show. Here you see actually an image that had nothing to do with this debate, but I found it actually sort of funny image because this is actually from some Eastern Europe parliament where people are fighting. But to me, it is the image that is arising in this debate, because this debate is often so emotional. And why is that? And I think the answer lies, at least partly, in the fact that it touches upon metaphysical questions. It touches upon a basis of our worldview that we find important, and that therefore it raises emotions with us. It's really not a scientific debate about biology, evolutionary biology. It's really about a debate about questions: where do we come from? What is man? Who am I? Is there a plan? Is there a God? And for many people, this whole debate prompts questions of this, which relate to these emotions that relate to these questions. And part of the confusion that I've seen happening is that I'm talking to a very academic crowd here, so with you, evolution does not arise negative connotations, I guess, but to many people in the broader audience it does. And so, at the one hand, it's this word evolution stands for fascinating science, population genetics, paleontology, ecology, and so forth, and I'm really fascinated by that and do part of that research myself actually in my lab. And clearly science and unambiguously shows the whole story unfolding over billions of years where biological life arose in the last 4 billion years on Earth. But at the same time, the same word evolution is sometimes used in a completely different context. And say non-religious, as far as I know, philosophers of science like Michael Ruse and Mary Midgley have even terms this evolution can be named as a secular religion. That's a very strong phrasing, I find. But some people have said, Michael Ruse has said that, is evolution even serving something like a secular religion? Because it has some attributes like a religion, like a worldview, a story about man, a story about purpose, that everything is random chance. Actually, then we're more talking about evolutionism than biological evolution, obviously. Maybe a brief excursion, because many of you are quite aware of this whole discussion in Britain, I guess, but not so much perhaps like in the Netherlands. Very briefly, I have a timeline from Abraham Kuyper to the current discussion. So maybe start with Abraham Kuyper, which you may know was our prime minister a century ago, and he started actually the Free University of Amsterdam as a Christian university in 1880 or so. He also became the rector of that the university, and he had a rectoral speech on evolution actually in 1899, where he has a sort of dual perception of evolution in the exact same sense I just mentioned to you. So he was negative about evolution as a worldview, a new faith, a comprehensive worldview derived from one sense with a new faith. So evolution already then was also by Haeckel and others coined as a sort of basis for an atheistic worldview. But he was positive about evolution as a mechanism in biology, where he says in Dutch here, which you cannot read probably, that we should not impose our ideas on the ultimate creator of the universe. And I share this view of Kuiper. Then, so this set the tone of the debate among Christians in the early 19th century. Then, in particular, Jan Lever, a biologist at the VU University in the mid-20th century, he had extensive arguments for theistic evolution, the idea that God created through a long evolutionary path in the mid-20th century. Then late 20th century, the discussion really erupted. And part of that was influential books by Arie van den Beukel. He was a critiquer of evolutionism, but no lover of creationism certainly as well. This was the 1990s. But actually in parallel, in the 1970s, creationism really rose in the Netherlands, like in many countries, but in the Netherlands in particular it was stimulated by evangelical broadcast organization, the AEO, which organized a huge debate in the 70s, Adam or Ape, and it was very influential among Christians to actually push them more towards creationism, unfortunately. And sort of this discussion revived some 10 years ago. I edited a number of books, say on chance and direction evolution, on evolution and creation theology, on science and religion, and a book with more personal stories and some other books. And this first book in particular ignited the discussion on creation and evolution in the Netherlands, in particular on intelligent design, which you probably have heard about. That really gave a rather confused debate, because it was a discussion about many items in parallel. It was a valid discussion about complexity in nature, how to describe biological complexity, how to quantify that. It was at the same time a discussion about mechanisms that drive evolution. It was a discussion about the nature of science, what is really allowed as an explanation in science. It was a discussion about science and religion. It was a discussion even about teaching of evolution at high schools and so forth. A very confused discussion. My own opinion, just to be clear on that, because I also was seen as one of the advocates of intelligent design, which I can say more about, is that it's clear that life developed through an evolutionary path. I'm convinced, I'm a believer, I believe in God, so I'm convinced that there's sort of grand design of the whole creation that's upheld by God. And I had an initial interest in this intelligent design hypothesis that you could develop methods to quantify a methodology for quantifying design, for example. And I liked that idea. I was sort of interested in that for a while, but I was really disappointed because it didn't work in practice. It never really yielded any use for quantitation of design. So I turned away from it, and I was very clear to distance myself from that. The main outcome of all the discussion 10 years ago, I would say in Holland, was there's not really a major change of opinion among scientists. There was actually a lot more visibility that there are actually Christians at many positions in geology, astronomy, and many other areas in the academic world. And just in the last, and there was basically a new discussion about creation and evolution. This last year, I published a children's book with a children's book author, Corine Oranje. She's written 67 children's books or so. Het geheime logboek van Toddler Tycho. It's about a nerd, a boy, 11 years old. It's actually geared towards children 8 till 12, interested in science. It's written from a Christian perspective. It's a story about a boy who basically he's at school and he loves fossils and he's just a nerd. He loves science and all that. And he's secretly in love as a girl in the class. And then at some point there's a meteorite striking the school, and there's an astronomer coming there, and that's his uncle. He's very proud. And he tells about the Big Bang and the cosmos and everything. And then the next day, this is a Christian school, and there's some parents a little angry. What is this stories about billions of years and all that? That's not in the Bible. And then the school class basically goes on an adventure to search for the truth. They go to a camp, a science camp, and they learn about evolution, they learn about the cosmos and all that. And it's written from a Christian perspective. There's a lot of love for science, and there's lots of modern forms like WhatsApp and all kind of things in there. There's a lot of humor, but it advocates this idea of theistic evolution, which actually I find nicely exemplified in this famous icon, where actually this guy now walks with the Bible under his arm here. Actually, and I find it a really good icon actually, because we did evolve naturally from primates, but we are people that can discuss the Bible and so forth, right? And this Bible is given to us. But this arose a lot of discussion, in particular continued discussion on Christians about creation and evolution the last year. So that's a bit about the Dutch situation. So my personal journey is basically a drift from, well, don't know really, to interest in design to really theistic evolution. And there's been many books been helpful to me. For example, Dallas Alexander's book, Creation and Evolution, Do We Have to Choose? Or in particular also this book, more recent book, The Lost World of Adam and Eve, by a wonderful scholar, John Walton, who looks at the Old Testament text from Genesis 1 to 3. So that's been very helpful. So maybe to wrap up there, evolution from a Christian perspective is that basically all Christians believe that God created the world, but there's different views, like from young earth Christianism to biologos, that God created evolution in billions of years. And you have to realize that there's of course a rich tradition here. It's not only the last 50 years where mostly this young earth creationism came up, but say Augustine or so already phrased views which take the biblical text very seriously and at the same time take a much broader view on the actual material process of creation. And another example is the reception of Darwinism at the end of the 19th century was actually quite mixed and sometimes very favorable from the Christian churches and all that. So I think creation and evolution can really be reconciled in harmony, where I can take entirely serious the biblical revelation that God is our creator and the fact, the knowledge that we've gained through science on how God created the world. Many of the discussions focus actually on basically biblical interpretation. And I believe that the Bible is the Word of God, but I also ask that question, what does that mean? How do these words come to us? Of course, they come to us through cultures, through cultural context. And for example, Calvin promotes this idea of accommodation. The Almighty has to accommodate to us, which he eventually does in Jesus Christ in the ultimate form, but also in the Bible, to come to us in our culture, in our language, in our ways of communication. Like a mother who is an adult who speaks very differently to another adult than to her 2-year-old child, where she basically goes down to her knees and speaks to that child in words of a child of 2. So in the same way, God accommodates to us and communicates to us in these creation stories in a language fit for people of all ages and cultures. So we have these creation stories, and we can read about this, and I find them extremely insightful and important, because it addresses really key elements, that God is creator, that man is not godly but the creator of earthly dust, that man is special and different than all other animals, made in the image of God, that man has a destination, that man is male, female, that good and evil exist, that man is sinful, wants to rule, obtain power, be as God. All these notions are in the creation stories, but actually almost none of those are sort of about natural science statements, right? So let's keep things in context and keep focus. Well, among Christians, the most questions done are really then, how about Adam and Eve, historic Adam, the fall, the consequences of the sin of Adam? They're good questions, they're open to discussion. What I find useful, this was in Dallas Alexander's book, for example, and more recently in a book by a wonderful theologian from Leiden, Amsterdam, in a book that he will be publishing this year actually, to come up with models. As a scientist, I like models because models can fit my data in certain ways, and they fit better or they fit worse, and you choose from model A versus B because model B fits the data better. So in the same way, you can look at certain coherent stories from, say, a young historic model to an ahistoric model or prehistoric models, and you can see how certain models fit to both the biblical text in all its seriousness, as well as to the data that we have from natural sciences. And sort of from the big ops for sort of model 2 or 4, and I sort of converge also to model 4, but we can discuss this in detail. This is getting a little detailed. So recap, so what I talked about, mostly it was sort of my meandering path in science and also in faith and this discussion about creation evolution. Keith also asked me a little bit to, and then I will end up with 2 minutes on that, to say, is this creation evolution story the only thing where this whole discussion plays out? And of course not. I work in nanotechnology that ignites discussions about human enhancement and transhumanism. I work in synthetic biology. So let me quickly say a few words about that, and then I'll wrap up. So synthetic biology is this whole new approach. Actually, it's really a new approach. So biology for millennia has been the study of nature as we see around us. Now we're entering a phase in mankind where we actually can engineer biology. So that is a quite big thing, and many sort of branches of science, nanotechnology, genomics, information technology, come together in this field of synthetic biology. And there's examples of top-down synthetic biology, for example, the work by Venter, where he sort of makes a synthetic genome, coded the way he likes, and then he puts it into living cells, take out the normal DNA, implant the synthesized DNA, and then that object is still alive. And it was actually sold as playing God, and we can have a discussion about that in the past. And I told you already about my own efforts, my goal to sort of build up from the bottom objects that basically have all the objects that we associate with life. Metabolism, information transfer, division, evolution. So in a sense we could create life. Suppose this is successful, right? What impact would that have? Right? Well, for example, this would give us better understanding of real biological life. I really believe that by studying model system, minimalistic model system, we can learn about this. It would improve our understanding of complexity. There may be even consequences for origin of life. Currently, we do not know, 4 billion years ago, how cells arose from components. We know there's lots of components around on the early Earth, but we do not know how this basically compounded into living cells. And we might even think about certain practical applications. So the impact can be really large at a fundamental level. There even will be broader impact because it will ignite new questions. What is living actually? How do you define life? What is living versus non-living? What is natural actually? What is natural versus synthetic? Also ethical question. Are we capable of handling the fantastic capabilities with such technology in a responsible way? And a question to me that's often asked, since many people know I'm a Christian, are you allowed to do this? Shouldn't you leave creating life to God, for example? And about that last question, to finish off this talk, where I relate my science to my faith, I would say yes, definitely, we should do this. As a scientist who is a Christian, I really feel this urge to explore the potentialities that are in nature, to extract the principles there, and to, as I told you already, we have this command to responsibly cultivate the earth, right? And to use this knowledge basically to glorify God and serve our neighbors, I would say. So I don't see any reason to not explore it. On the contrary, I feel the urge to do explore this and to look where we end up. So to sum up, I'm a wanderer. I wonder about all these meandering paths which sometimes cross. My science shifted from condensed metaphysics to nanobiology. I experience no conflict really between my science and my faith. I find this worldview concept very useful. I do think the Christian worldview provides an excellent framework for understanding the world. And I understand this world to be an evolutionary creation. And I think synthetic biology provides some fascinating research questions and broader insights. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kees, for a fascinating tour of Dutch science, Dutch religion, and your own personal journey. We have a few moments for some questions. Can I take one from just there? I think Cara's with the microphone.
Hi, so I sort of have a question about scientific culture in the sense, since you kind of, in your career went from, physics to biology. In my experience, I tend to find that sort of the more scientists is on the mathematical, theoretical end, actually the less unlikely they are to be sympathetic to the notion of a creator or a God and so forth. And then the more towards biology one gets, I tend to find more kind of resistance and opposition to the notion of a creator, of God. And my sort of thought is simply that the physicists and mathematicians are kind of, in their work, they're looking for these organizing principles. And even someone like Feynman will kind of almost talk in a deistic language of sort of like we're trying to figure out the equations that, somehow were made up, and he doesn't really maybe mean that literally, but somehow it's kind of, the science pushes in that direction. Whereas it seems like biologists, not so much biophysicists, who surely from the physics background have more of a search for organizing principles, but the biologists I talk about, they tend to be so specialist. Everything is different, everything has its own specific rules, and evolution is like the one thing that's kind of organizing principle, and that makes everything seem kind of random and games. So I'm just curious, from your experience, whether you see any correlation with sort of the science community and their receptivity to the notion of a creator God.
Well, I certainly recognize what you're saying. It's true that more physicists are sort of open to the idea of God than biologists. I think there's clearly a sort of historic notion here. There's been so much polarization in the last 50 years or so between, say, creationists and biologists. Biologists sort of sick of all this discussion, so many times retract to that other position and not open to the idea of God at all. But I do recognize what you're saying. At the same time, I'm sitting in all kind of biological conferences, talks. There's so much talk about, for example, design. I know it's a bit of a forbidden word after this unfortunate intelligent design discussion, but that's not what I mean. But biologists also talk about the design of certain networks and the sort of way it's there and how it evolved there, and sort of sometimes even have to make a sort of disclaimer that, of course, this is evolution, of course, there's no God, right? But so in biology, by the nature of the biology, I don't see any notion at all why biology couldn't sort of trigger you to the wonder of, and in that sense, sort of be a starting point for more metaphysical questions about the nature of reality. It's just a sort of unfortunate historic development of the last half century, I think, that prompts this in such a strong polarization. Dennis wants to respond to this, I think. No?
Dennis, yeah.
Just a quick comment. It's interesting that in the research results from Professor Elaine Eklund from Rice University, which is a big study on the religious beliefs of the scientific community in the top 21 research universities in the USA. In fact, she interestingly, and was looking at things like biologists, physicists, basic natural sciences, she actually found no difference in the instance of believers in that population between the different disciplines. I was actually surprised, but that's what her data shows, so it's just an interesting observation.
Brian, just in front.
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting to hear about your meanderings, and I'm sure they resonate with others. But I'm curious how you got into this in the first place. Where did it begin?
What is it here?
Your Christian journey.
Okay, my Christian journey. I was raised in a moderate Christian family, and as a teenager I really had a bit of a philosophical mind, as I already mentioned, so I was questioning everything, and I pondered about many worldviews, and I made a commitment at some point to be Christian. Then when I was 35, actually I came in a sort of existential crisis in a sense, actually prompted by Dawkins, and sort of somewhere in the back of my mind was this small little voice, okay, you're a Christian, you're praying and all that, maybe it's all an illusion, how about you're fooling yourself. If there's a small little voice in the back of your mind, you can do two things. You can just, no, of course not, just live on and that's it. Or you can actually put it up front and address it head on. And that's so much more healthy. That's what I did, just by starting a book reading club with myself and debating with myself, mostly first. And then branching out to discussions with others. And in that context, I discovered this worldview concept, and it really helped me to think about these issues, gave me a framework to think about these issues. And then actually, so this basically reconfirmed my Christian faith, and so that's my sort of journey in a nutshell. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, and it is 2 o'clock, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to call to...
One gentleman in the back that All the time.
We will have to, but the gentleman at the back is Victor, isn't it? Come and speak to Case afterwards. I think we will have to stop there. We do say we'll finish at 2 o'clock. So can we join together in thanking Case for giving us a tour of his own experience.